3 generations all the same. This isn't psychosis. It's a curse. The evening sun cast long shadows across my driveway as I knelt beside my son's overturned bicycle, wrench in hand, trying to fix the chain that had somehow managed to twist itself into a pretzel. Again. 5-year-old bikes, I'd learned, had a supernatural ability to self-destruct at the most inconvenient moments. "Dad, can you make it go fast like a motorcycle?" Tommy asked, bouncing on his toes beside me, his gap to grin infectious despite my growing frustration with the stubborn chain. "Sure, buddy, just give me a minute to excuse me." I looked up to see my new neighbor standing at the edge of my driveway. Frank Morrison, retired cop, late 60s with the kind of weathered face that suggested he'd seen too much during his career. We'd moved to Maple Grove 6 months ago, and Frank had been polite but distant, the kind of guy who mowed his lawn at exactly 7 a.m. every Saturday and kept his property immaculate. "Hey, Frank, what's up?" His eyes weren't on me, though. They were fixed on my wife, Sarah, who was playing catch with Tommy in the backyard. Something about his expression made my stomach tighten. "This might sound strange," Frank said, his voice carefully controlled. "But what's your wife's maiden name?" I blinked. "That's kind of a random question. Humor me." Sarah's laughter drifted across the yard as Tommy missed another easy throw. She looked perfect in the golden light, blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing the yoga pants and fitted top that made her look like she'd stepped out of a Suburban magazine. At 36, she still turned heads at the grocery store. "It's Nillik," I said finally. "Sarah Nillik, before we married, why?" Frank's face went white. Actually, white like someone had drained all the color from his cheeks. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded yellowed newspaper clipping. "Take your son and run," he said quietly, pressing the paper into my hands. "Don't tell her why." Before I could respond, he was walking back toward his house with quick, purposeful steps. I unfolded the clipping with shaking fingers. The headline hit me like a physical blow. "Mother and 5-year-old son on his birthday." Below it, a grainy photograph of a woman being led away in handcuffs. The article was dated 15 years ago. I scanned the text quickly. Linda Klin, 32, was arrested yesterday after allegedly drowning her 5-year-old son, Marcus, in the family bathtub during what neighbors described as a birthday party gone wrong. Killin, Nillik backwards. "Hey, honey, what's that?" I spun around to find Sarah standing behind me, her face flushed from playing with Tommy. She was looking at the newspaper clipping in my hands, and I watched her expression change from curiosity to something that looked like recognition to barely controlled panic. "It's nothing," I said, but she was already reaching for it. "Let me see." Her voice had an edge I'd never heard before. "Sarah, it's just some old." She snatched the clipping from my hands and stared at it. For a moment, she was completely still. Then she forced a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "Where did you get this garbage?" "Some true crime podcast nonsense." She crumpled the paper in her fist. "You know how I feel about this kind of sensational media." "Frank gave it to me." He seemed to think, "Frank." Her voice went up an octave. "That paranoid old man, David, he's clearly losing his mind. You can't seriously be entertaining this insanity." But I was watching her hands shake as she shoved the crumpled clipping into her pocket. I was noticing how she kept glancing toward the house where Tommy was now playing with his toy cars on the porch. "The name in the article," I said carefully. "Killin. That's a coincidence." Her tone was sharp now, all pretense of casual dismissal gone. "David, I can't believe you're actually considering this. It's my maiden name backwards." "So what? There are probably thousands of people with similar names." She was right, of course. It was insane. Paranoid conspiracy theory nonsense from a bored retiree who'd probably spent too many years seeing the worst in people. But as Sarah stalked back toward the house calling for Tommy to come inside for dinner, I couldn't shake the image of her face when she'd first seen that headline. Not confusion, not indignation, recognition. I spent the next 3 days trying to convince myself that Frank Morrison was just a paranoid old cop with too much time on his hands. Sarah acted completely normal, making breakfast, helping Tommy with his kindergarten homework, talking about her cases at the law firm where she worked as a partner. But I found myself watching her differently, noticing things I'd somehow missed before. Like how she always got tense around Tommy's birthday, how she'd suggested more than once that maybe we should skip the big party this year. How she sometimes stared at him with an expression I couldn't quite read. On Thursday evening, I knocked on Frank's door. He answered wearing a faded Police Academy t-shirt and holding a cup of coffee that smelled like it could strip paint. "Figured you'd be back," he said, stepping aside to let me in. Frank's house was exactly what I'd expected. Neat, sparse, with the kind of furniture that prioritized function over style. But what caught my attention were the filing cabinets lining one wall of his living room and the bulletin board covered with newspaper clippings, photographs, and what looked like police reports. "You kept working after you retired," I observed. "Cold cases, hobby of mine." He gestured toward the board. "Your wife's family is on there." I moved closer and felt my blood turn to ice water. There were 3 newspaper clippings, all featuring different women with variations of the same name. Linda Klin, Karen Nillick, Susan Clinsworth. All had ended their 5-year-old sons. "Jesus Christ," I whispered. "It's a pattern," Frank said matter-of-factly. "Goes back 3 generations. Always the mother, always a 5-year-old boy, always on or around the child's birthday. This is insane. You're talking about my wife, the mother of my son. Your son who's turning 5 next month." The words hung in the air between us like a death sentence. "There has to be an explanation," I said, but my voice sounded weak even to me. "Mental illness runs in families, sure, but this specific, this targeted." Frank poured himself another cup of coffee and didn't offer me one. "I worked homicide for 32 years. You learn to trust patterns, and this pattern says your boy is in danger." I stared at the bulletin board, trying to process what I was seeing. "How did you even know to look into this? Your wife's not as careful as she thinks. I saw her throwing away mail a few weeks ago. Letters addressed to Sarah Klin. When someone's using their maiden name for correspondence, they're hiding from their husband. That's usually worth investigating." My stomach dropped. "What kind of correspondence?" "Medical records from a psychiatric facility upstate." The room started spinning. I grabbed the back of Frank's couch to study myself. "She's been getting treatment." Was the letters were discharged summaries. "Looks like she was released about 8 months ago. Right around the time you folks moved here." 8 months ago. We'd moved to Maple Grove because Sarah said she wanted a fresh start after her promotion at the firm. A chance for Tommy to grow up in a safe neighborhood with good schools. "I need to see those letters," I said. Frank shook his head. "Already tried. She's smart. Burns everything in that little fire pit in your backyard. But I got enough from the return addresses to make some calls. Your wife was institutionalized for 18 months, following what her medical records describe as a psychotic break with violent ideation toward her male child." The words hit me like physical blows. That's not possible. She's never shown any signs of, but even as I said it, I was remembering things. How Sarah sometimes got that distant look when Tommy was being particularly loud or energetic. How she'd suggested boarding school might be good for his development when he was only 4. How she'd never seemed quite as attached to him as other mothers were to their children. "David." Frank's voice was gentle but firm. "I've seen this before. Not exactly this, but close enough. Some people are very good at hiding what's broken inside them until they're not." I left Frank's house feeling like I was walking through a nightmare. But instead of going home, I sat in my car at the end of the block and called Sarah's office. "Morrison, Klein, and Associates," the receptionist answered. "Hi, this is David Chen, Sarah's husband. I'm trying to reach her, but she's not answering her cell." "Oh, Mr. Chen, I'm sorry, but Sarah left about an hour ago. She said she had a client dinner." "Client dinner?" Sarah had told me she was working late on a brief and would grab something at the office. I drove to her law firm's parking garage. Her BMW was gone. For the next 2 hours, I drove around town looking for her car, feeling like a stalker, but unable to stop myself. Finally, I spotted the familiar silver sedan at the Riverside Motel, a rundown place on the outskirts of town that rented rooms by the hour. I parked across the street and waited. At 9:30, Sarah emerged from room 237. She wasn't alone. Daniel Reeves, her law partner, followed her out. They stood by her car for a moment, talking in low voices. Then he kissed her. Not a friendly peck-on. The cheek, but the kind of kiss that left no doubt about what had been happening in that motel room. I watched my wife of 7 years, the mother of my child, laugh at something Daniel said before getting in her car and driving away. The betrayal should have been the worst part, but all I could think about was Frank's bulletin board and those newspaper headlines. If Sarah was capable of this kind of deception, what else was she hiding? I didn't confront Sarah that night. Instead, I lay awake beside her, listening to her breathe, and wondering if the woman I'd married had ever really existed at all. By morning, I'd made a decision. I dropped Tommy off at kindergarten and called in sick to work. Then, I drove to Frank's house. "I need your help," I said when he answered the door. Over the next week, Frank taught me things they don't cover in corporate team-building seminars. How to conduct surveillance without being noticed, how to install hidden cameras, how to access public records and medical databases. The key, Frank explained as we sat in his living room surrounded by surveillance equipment, is to document everything. If this goes bad, and it might, you need evidence that will hold up in court. We started with Sarah's car. Frank showed me how to install a GPS tracker and a small recording device under the dashboard. Then we set up cameras in our house, hidden in smoke detectors and picture frames, focused on the common areas where Sarah spent time with Tommy. What we discovered over the next few days made my blood run cold. Sarah was living a double life that went far beyond the affair with Daniel. She was taking medication, antipsychotics, according to the pill bottles I found hidden in her office, but only sporadically. Some days she'd take them, others she'd flush them down the toilet. On the day she didn't take her medication, she was different with Tommy, more distant, more irritable. I watched her on the hidden cameras, saw how she'd stare at him with an expression that looked almost calculating, and she was meeting with Daniel almost every day, either at the motel or at his apartment downtown. The GPS tracker showed a pattern. Lunch meetings that stretched for hours, evening client dinners that ended at his place. But it was the audio recordings that revealed the real scope of her deception. "He's getting suspicious." Sarah's voice came through Frank's speakers, tiny but clear. "David's been asking questions about my family." "So what?" Daniel's voice. "It's not like he can prove anything. You don't understand. If he starts digging into my medical history, then we accelerate the timeline." "What do you mean?" "I mean we stop waiting for you to work up the courage. Tommy's birthday is in 3 weeks. After that, it won't matter what David suspects." I felt Frank's hand on my shoulder as I listened to my wife and her lover discuss my son's death like it was a business transaction. "The insurance money alone is worth $2 million, Daniel continued. "Plus your inheritance from your grandmother's trust. We could disappear. Start over somewhere new. It has to look natural," Sarah said. "Like an accident. Leave that to me. I've got it all worked out." Frank stopped the recording. "That's enough for now." I was shaking, actually trembling like I had a fever. "They're planning to end my son for money." "Money's part of it, but David," Frank's voice was careful. "I think there's more going on here. Your wife's medical history suggests this isn't just about insurance fraud." He was right, of course. The pattern Frank had shown me. 3 generations of women ending their 5-year-old sons, that wasn't about money. That was something much darker. "What do we do?" I asked. "We stop them." "How?" "If we go to the police with this, what do we have?" "Recordings that might not be admissible in court. A paranoid theory about generational violence." Frank smiled, and for the first time since I'd met him, it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Who said anything about going to the police?" Frank's plan was elegant in its simplicity. Instead of trying to convince the authorities that my wife was planning to homicide our son, we were going to make her and Daniel destroy themselves. "The beautiful thing about people like this," Frank explained, "is that they're fundamentally cowards. They can plan and scheme in secret, but the moment they're exposed, they fall apart. Step 1 was isolating Sarah from her support network. Daniel wasn't just her lover. He was her co-conspirator and emotional anchor. Remove him from the equation and Sarah would be vulnerable. I started with Daniel's wife. Monica Reeves was a pediatric surgeon at the Children's Hospital, brilliant and successful in her own right. She and Daniel had been married for 12 years and had 2 daughters. From the outside, they looked like the perfect power couple. I'd met Monica several times at law firm social events. She was sharp, funny, and clearly had no idea her husband was planning to homicide a child for insurance money. I called her office and asked to meet for coffee. "David, what a nice surprise," Monica said when she arrived at the downtown Starbucks I'd suggested. "How are Sarah and Tommy?" "That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about." I slid a manila envelope across the table. Inside were photographs Frank had taken of Daniel and Sarah at the motel along with transcripts of their recorded conversations. Not the parts about ending Tommy. Those were too dangerous to share, but enough to prove the affair and the insurance fraud discussion. Monica's face went through a series of changes as she read. Confusion. Disbelief, anger. Finally, a cold fury that reminded me why I'd never want to face her across an operating table. "How long?" she asked quietly. "At least 6 months, probably longer." She closed the envelope and looked at me with eyes that could have cut glass. "What do you want?" "I want them stopped, both of them." "Consider it done." Step 2 was exposing Sarah at work. Morrison, Klein, and Associates prided itself on its reputation for integrity. Partners who embezzled client funds and committed insurance fraud tended to find themselves not just fired, but facing criminal charges. Frank had discovered that Daniel had been skimming money from the firm's client trust accounts to finance his lifestyle. Nothing dramatic, a few hundred here, 1,000 there, but enough to constitute felony embezzlement. I compiled the evidence and sent it anonymously to the firm's managing partner along with proof of Daniel and Sarah's affair. Step 3 was the most dangerous, confronting Sarah directly. I waited until Tommy was at a sleepover at his friend Jake's house. Then I set up a video camera in our living room and waited for Sarah to come home from another client dinner. She walked in at 10:30 looking flushed and satisfied. When she saw me sitting in the darkened living room, she jumped. "David, you scared me. Why are you sitting in the dark?" I turned on the lamp beside my chair. "We need to talk." Something in my voice must have warned her because her expression immediately became guarded. "About what?" "About Daniel, about the motel, about your plans for Tommy's birthday." The color drained from her face, but she tried to maintain the pretense. "I don't know what you're talking about." I picked up the remote control and turned on the TV. The screen filled with audio waveforms as Daniel's voice filled the room. "Tommy's birthday is in 3 weeks. After that, it won't matter what David suspects." Sarah stared at the screen like it was a snake about to strike. "The insurance money alone is worth $2 million. She lunged for the remote, but I was faster. I stood up and backed away, keeping the device out of her reach. "It has to look natural, like an accident." "Turn it off," Sarah whispered. "Leave that to me. I've got it all worked out." "Turn it off." She was screaming now, her carefully maintained facade finally cracking. This was the real Sarah, the one who could plan her child's homicide like a business meeting. "You sick witch," I said quietly. "You were actually going to do it." "You don't understand," she said. And suddenly she was crying. "It's not what you think. I love Tommy. I would never hurt him. The recordings say otherwise. Those are out of context. Daniel was talking about something else. Some legal case. Stop lying." My voice was getting louder. "I know about your family history. I know about your mother and your grandmother. I know about the psychiatric facility." Sarah's tears stopped as suddenly as they'd started. When she looked at me now, her eyes were completely cold. "You've been busy," she said. "Not as busy as you. What do you want?" "I want you gone. Out of this house, away from Tommy. Out of our lives." She laughed and the sound made my skin crawl. "You think it's that simple? You think you can just throw me out and play happy family with our son? I have evidence of adultery, insurance fraud, and conspiracy to commit homicide. Try me. You have recordings that could have been faked. Photographs that prove nothing. And a lot of paranoid theories from a washed-up cop. Sarah's voice was getting stronger, more confident. But I have something better. What's that? I have a 5-year-old son who loves his mommy. Who will tell any judge that daddy has been acting scary and angry lately? Who will cry and ask why daddy is trying to take him away from me? The threat was clear. Even if I could prove everything I suspected, a custody battle would be long and ugly. And in the meantime, Tommy would be alone with her. You're forgetting something, I said. What's that? Daniel's wife got those same recordings today along with evidence of his embezzlement. By now, he's probably been arrested. Sarah's confident expression faltered. You're lying. My phone buzzed. I glanced at the text message and smiled. Monica Reeves says to tell you that Daniel's been taken into custody. He's already started talking about the insurance fraud. Apparently, he's not as loyal as you thought. Sarah stared at me for a long moment. Then she started laughing again, but this time it sounded broken. You think you've won? She said. You think you've saved Tommy? I know I have. You stupid men. You have no idea what you're dealing with. This isn't about money. This isn't about Daniel. This is about what I am, what my family is. She moved toward the stairs and I stepped to block her path. Where are you going to pack? Isn't that what you want? Tommy's not here. I know where he is. Her smile was terrible. Jake's house, 1247 Elm Street. His parents are at their book club until midnight. My blood turned to ice. If you go near him, what? You'll call the police with what evidence? Those recordings you say prove I'm planning to hurt him. The ones where I never actually say anything about hurting anyone. She was right. The recordings were damning in context, but they weren't explicit enough to justify an immediate arrest. And by the time I could convince anyone to take action, it might be too late. Sarah, please. He's your son. No, she said quietly. He's not. Not anymore. Not after what you've done. She pushed past me toward the stairs, and I made a decision that would haunt me forever. I grabbed her arm. Sarah spun around when I grabbed her. And for a moment, I saw something in her eyes that wasn't entirely human. Pure rage, but also something deeper. Something that had been hiding behind the mask of suburban motherhood for 5 years. Let go of me, she said, her voice deadly quiet. I can't let you leave. Not tonight. You can't stop me. She was probably right. I was. Bigger and stronger, but I couldn't physically restrain her indefinitely. And if I called the police, what would I tell them? That my wife might hurt our son based on some old newspaper clippings and ambiguous recordings. But I didn't have to stop her alone. My phone was already dialing Frank's number. It's happening, I said when he answered. She knows we have the recordings. She's threatening to go after Tommy. Where is he? Jake Morrison's house on Elm Street. The parents are out. I'm on my way there. You keep her busy. Sarah had heard enough of the conversation to understand what was happening. Her expression shifted from rage to something that looked almost like relief. You really think that old men can protect Tommy from me? She asked. I think he's dealt with people like you before. People like me, she laughed. You still don't understand, do you? You think this is some kind of mental illness, some chemical imbalance that can be fixed with therapy and medication, isn't it? My grandmother ended her son in 1987. My mother ended my brother in 2003. It's not madness, David. It's tradition. The casual way she said it made my skin crawl. That's insane, is it? For 3 generations, the women in my family have been chosen. Called to make a sacrifice to prevent something much worse from happening. What could be worse than ending children? Sarah's smile was terrible. You'll find out. She started toward the door and I moved to block her path again. This time she didn't try to push past me. Instead, she pulled a kitchen knife from her purse. Sarah, don't do this. I tried to do it quietly, painlessly. An accident that would look natural, but you forced my hand. The knife gleamed in the lamplight. It was one of our good ones from the set we'd gotten as a wedding present. Sharp enough to cut through bone. Put the knife down. I can't. You don't understand what happens if I don't complete the ritual. The consequences. There is no ritual. There are no consequences. You're sick. Sarah. You need help. I needed you to trust me, to let me do what had to be done. But instead, you chose to interfere. She lunged at me with the knife, and I barely managed to grab her wrist. We struggled for control of the blade, crashing into furniture, knocking over lamps. Sarah was stronger than I'd expected, fueled by whatever delusion had taken hold of her mind. The sacrifice has to be made, she gasped as we fought. If not Tommy's, then yours will have to do. I managed to twist the knife away from her and send it skittering across the floor. But Sarah wasn't finished. She grabbed a heavy glass vase from the coffee table and swung it at my head. I ducked and the vase shattered against the wall behind me. Sarah, stop. This isn't you. Yes, it is, she screamed. This is who I've always been, who I was born to be. She came at me again, this time with a shard of broken glass. I caught her hands, but she was beyond reason now, beyond anything that resembled the woman I'd married. The children have to die, she whispered, her face inches from mine. It's the only way to keep the darkness at bay. My grandmother understood. My mother understood. Why can't you? Because it's not real. Whatever you think you're preventing, it's not real, isn't it? The lights went out. Not just in our house, in the entire neighborhood. Through the windows, I could see that the street lights were dark. The houses around us swallowed by an unnatural blackness. Sarah stopped struggling and started laughing. It's too late, she said. You waited too long. The ritual should have been completed by now. A sound echoed through the darkness. Something that might have been wind, but wind didn't usually sound like screaming. What's happening? I whispered. The darkness is coming back, Sarah said. The thing my family has been holding back for 3 generations. And because you stopped me from making the sacrifice, the screaming sound got louder, closer. Through the window, I could see shapes moving in the darkness, things that weren't quite human. This is impossible, I said. But my voice sounded weak even to me. Is it? You've seen the pattern. 3 generations of women ending their sons. Did you really think it was just coincidence? Just madness? My phone rang. Frank's number. David. His voice was frantic. Something's wrong here. The power's out and there are things in the darkness. Things that shouldn't exist. Where's Tommy? Safe for now, but I don't know how long we can hold them off. The line went dead. Sarah smiled in the darkness. It's not too late. I can still complete the ritual. The darkness will accept Tommy's essence, even if it's not on his birthday, over my dead body, if necessary. She pulled another knife from her purse, smaller than the first, but just as sharp. Where had she been hiding all these tools? The ritual requires the essence of a 5-year-old male child, she said, advancing on me. But it will accept the essence of the child's father as a substitute. The darkness isn't picky. I backed toward the kitchen, looking for anything I could use as a tool. Behind Sarah through the living room window, I could see more shapes moving in the unnatural night. Even if you end me, I said, Frank won't let you near Tommy. Frank is an old man with a tool. I am a mother with a sacred duty. She lunged at me again, and this time I was ready. I grabbed the cast iron skillet from the stove and swung it as hard as I could. The impact sent Sarah crashing into the kitchen island. She lay still for a moment and I thought I might have knocked her unconscious. Then she started to change. Her skin began to darken, taking on a mottled, bruised appearance. Her fingers stretched and became claw-like. When she looked up at me, her eyes were completely black. You should have let me complete the ritual, she said. But her voice was different now, deeper, not entirely human. What are you? I am what the women in my family become when the ritual fails. I am. What happens when the darkness is allowed to take hold? She stood up and I could see that she was taller now, her limbs elongated and wrong. But it's not too late. I can still make the sacrifice. I can still save this world from what's coming. She moved toward me with inhuman speed, but I was already running out of the kitchen, through the living room, toward the front door. The street outside was chaos. The shapes I'd seen through the window were everywhere now. Things that looked like people but moved wrong. Their limbs bent at impossible angles. The screaming sound was coming from them. I ran toward my car, but Sarah was faster. She tackled me in the driveway, her claws raking across my back. The essence must be spilled, she hissed in my ear. If not willingly, then by force. I rolled over and kicked her as hard as I could. She flew backward, hitting the garage door with a sickening crunch. But she got up again. Whatever she'd become, it wasn't easy to stop. I made it to my car and started the engine. In the rearview mirror, I could see Sarah running after me, her movements jerky and unnatural. The drive to Elm Street took 3 minutes that felt like 3 hours. The entire neighborhood was dark, filled with those impossible shapes. Some of them tried to block my path, but the car passed right through them like they were made of smoke. Frank's truck was parked outside Jake's house, and I could see muzzle flashes from the upstairs windows. He was firing at something, but I couldn't tell what. I ran to the front door and found it barricaded. "Frank, it's David." The door opened and Frank pulled me inside. His face was grim, his police-issue pistol in his hand. "Where are the boys?" I asked. "Upstairs bathroom, locked in and safe for now." "What are those things outside?" "Heck, if I know they showed up right after the power went out. They're trying to get in, but they can't seem to cross the threshold." "Sarah's coming. She's changed. Become something else." Frank nodded like this made perfect sense. The ritual. When it fails, the women in her family become vessels for the darkness they're supposed to be controlling. "You knew about this?" "Suspected. The pattern was too specific to be natural. But I hoped I was wrong." A sound from outside made us both freeze. Sarah's voice, but distorted, inhuman. "David, I know you're in there. Bring me the boy and I'll make it quick." "Like heck," Frank muttered. "There has to be a way to stop this," I said. "There is. Complete the ritual." "What?" "The darkness needs essence. 5-year-old male essence specifically. That's what keeps it contained. I'm not letting you hurt my son. Not Tommy." Frank's expression was grim. "Me? You're not 5 years old." "No, but I was once. And the ritual doesn't specify that the essence has to be fresh." He rolled up his sleeve, revealing a long scar along his forearm. "I've been carrying this darkness for 70 years, he said. "Ever since my mother tried to complete the ritual and failed, the scar contains essence from when I was 5. Essence that was offered but never used. That's insane." "Is it more insane than what's happening outside?" Before I could answer, the windows exploded inward. Sarah crawled through the broken glass, her transformed body moving like a spider. "Found you," she hissed. Frank raised his tool, but Sarah was faster. She knocked the tool from his hand and sent him flying across the room. "Where is he?" she demanded. "Where is my son?" "He's not your son anymore," I said. "You gave up that right when you tried to end him." "I was trying to save him, to save all of us." She lunged at me, but this time I was ready. I grabbed the knife she dropped earlier and drove it into her chest. Sarah looked down at the blade, then back at me. She smiled. "You can't end what's already dead," she said. Then Frank was behind her. His scarred arm badly injured. He pressed the wound against Sarah's transformed flesh, and she began to scream. The sound was deafening. Inhuman. But as Frank's injury touched her, Sarah began to change back. Her skin lightened, her limbs returned to normal proportions. Her eyes became human again. "No," she whispered. "The ritual, it has to be completed." "It is completed," Frank said quietly. "The price has been paid. The darkness is contained." Outside, the screaming stopped. The warped silhouettes dissolved into nothing and the street lights flickered back to life. Sarah collapsed to the floor, her body returning to normal, though her breathing was still shallow and uneven. "Tommy," she whispered. I need to see Tommy. No, I said firmly. You're never going near him again. Please, I'm still his mother. No, you're not. I heard footsteps on the stairs. Tommy appeared in the doorway, his face streaked with tears, but otherwise unharmed. Daddy, what happened to Mommy? I looked at Sarah lying broken on the floor, then at Frank, who was bandaging his arm with a dish towel. Mommy got very sick, I said finally. But she's going to get help now. Sarah tried to reach for Tommy, but her strength was gone. I'm sorry, she whispered. I'm so sorry. Then her eyes closed and she was still. The paramedics arrived 20 minutes later, followed by the police. The official report would say that Sarah had suffered a complete psychotic break and attacked her family before dying of a brain aneurysm. The power outage was attributed to a transformer explosion. No one mentioned the ritual. No one talked about the darkness. Some things, Frank explained later, were better left unexplained. Tommy and I moved in with Frank temporarily while I figured out what came next. The old cop was surprisingly good with children, and Tommy seemed to enjoy having a grandfather figure around. Sarah was buried in the town cemetery far from her mother and grandmother. I didn't attend the funeral. A month later, I was cleaning out her office when I found a letter addressed to Tommy. It was dated the day before she died. My dearest son. It began. By the time you read this, you'll be old enough to understand what happened. I want you to know that everything I did because I loved you. The darkness that runs in our family is real, and it's hungry. I tried to protect you from it the only way I knew how. I failed, but Frank succeeded where I could not. The ritual is complete and you are safe. Live your life, be happy, and never forget that despite everything, your mother loved you more than life itself. I burned the letter without showing it to Tommy. Some burdens are too heavy for a child to carry. But sometimes late at night, I wonder if Sarah was right. If the darkness is still out there waiting. If the ritual really did contain it or if it just bought us time. I guess we'll find out when Tommy turns 18 and has children of his own. Until then, I watch him play in the yard, laughing and innocent, and I try not to think about the future. Frank says the darkness is contained and I choose to believe him. I have to. This is where the story ends. How was today's story? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and where you're watching from. Like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories.